The groove-billed ani is a species of cuckoo found from northern Chile to southern Texas, which is probably nothing like what you picture when you think of a cuckoo. It belongs to a small group of cuckoos in the subfamily Crotaphagine, also known as the social nesting cuckoos, which includes only 4 species in 2 genera: the 3 species of ani in the genus Crotaphagine, and the monophyletic genus Gira. I fell in love with giras at the Walk-In South America aviary at the San Antonio Zoo, where some of the birds seem to watch me with a fascination that seems to be rare in birds outside of parrots and songbirds. And I have a good hypothesis as to why this might be, which has to do with their extremely unusual reproductive strategy, which is almost certainly not the one you're imagining when you hear the word cuckoo. Unfortunately, despite the fact that giras are pretty common in zoos, the group as a whole seems to be poorly known in popular culture. So I'm going to do my small part to attempt to fix that. Let me tell you about them as I make a figurine of one of those cuckoos, the groove-billed ani. Hello, and welcome to EdGooby, where I make arts and crafts of animals that are evolutionarily distinct, biogeographically unusual, and/or behaviorally interesting. For my first ever video, I am going to be making a figurine of a groove-billed ani. This bird and its 3 closest relatives might just be my favorite group of birds that are neither parrots nor songbirds, and on some level, these birds represent every facet of the channel name. I will be making a clay sculpture with air-dry clay in a somewhat abstracted style. This is both because I tend to like the slightly more abstracted styles often seen in folk art, and because I frankly am not at the skill level where I can make anything hyper-realistic. Now, I have to admit that I'm a bit of a perfectionist. After prototyping roughly how I was going to do this in non-drying plasticine modeling clay, it took me 3 attempts with air-dry clay before I got a model I was happy enough with to use in this video. And then I actually went and made another one because I discovered that my camcorder had defaulted to hard-coding timestamps. Timestamps that aren't even accurate because if I had known I needed to set the clock, I would have known to turn off the timestamp function. But I lost a chunk of the follow-up footage when the camera battery died, so y'all get to see my 4th attempt instead. I will be making this figurine in several pieces and sticking them together, starting with the body running from the beak to tail. The groove-billed ani has a rather large head that is sort of triangular looking down and rectangular looking from the side, if you don't count the beak, which is of course its most distinctive feature. I am shocked by how much the tail resembles the tail of the male of a much better known Texas bird, the aptly named great-tailed grackle. You see this a lot with birds, actually, where 2 species that aren't particularly related, living in an overlapping geographic area, end up looking remarkably similar. I am essentially going for a roughly 2D silhouette from the head to the base of the tail, although we will see that I do things a bit differently with the beak and the tail itself. The beak I will be narrowing down a bit because it is a relatively flat beak on the actual bird, and the tail I will be widening to suggest the magnificent tail of the real thing. In my initial prototypes, I reduced the tail down significantly because it is basically the size of the bird. But as you will see, about midway through this model, I decided to go for a tail which comes closer in size to the actual one, although still not as big proportionately as the real thing. Once I have the body roughly in the silhouette that I want, I'm going to make the wings and I'm attempting to make them more or less match before I stick them on with water. If this were actual clay that you bake in a kiln, I would need to be scoring the edges, joining them together with slip, and then pressing them together hard to make sure there are no air bubbles that will cause it to explode and take out everything else in the kiln along with it. Once I have the wings attached, I will make and attach the feet, and I'll tell you more about the feet in a moment. But first, let me tell you a bit more about the groove-billed ani and its relatives. Cuckoos are a fascinating group of birds in general. Obviously the best known are the Old World brood parasitic cuckoos of the tribe Cuculini. And this makes sense because brood parasitism has been successful for this group, and the 55 species of the Old World brood parasitic cuckoos make up over 1/3 of all known cuckoo species. However, as is often the case when you have a wildly successful and extremely speciose group of animals, you can find much more genetic and behavioral diversity in their lesser known but close relatives. The entire tribe Cuculini is obligatorily brood parasitic, and they are the only members of the family that are obligatorily brood parasitic. However, several other species have evolved varying levels of opportunistic brood parasitism, coming close to being obligatory in a couple of species. But the social nesting cuckoos, the 4 species I talk about, lie near the very base of the cuckoo family tree, making this an example of the evolutionarily distinct part of the channel name. While evolutionary distinctiveness is a concept devised by the London Zoo for conservation purposes, the neat thing about it is that it's essentially fractal for any group of animals. And it is often these members that score higher on evolutionary distinctiveness which can tell us interesting things about the history of the group as the whole. Here, for example, while most of the more evolutionarily distinct branches of the cuckoo family are ground nesting, including the roadrunner, which most people don't even realize is a cuckoo, they all fall on the same broad branch as the social nesting cuckoos, which do nest in trees, suggesting that this was likely the ancestral state. We can also tell from the fact that most of these earlier branches raised their own young as solitary couples that this was the ancestral state of the cuckoos as well, although the fact that it has evolved in the family multiple times suggests that something in the group pre-adapts them to brood parasitism. Perhaps it's just a natural flexibility around chick-rearing strategy, which allowed both brood parasitism and the unusual cooperative nesting strategy of the Crotaphagine cuckoos to evolve. And this cooperative nesting strategy is an extremely rare one. While I'm sure there are at least a few examples I'm not aware of or just forgetting, I can only think of one other group of animals that employs this as its reproductive strategy off the top of my head. I can think of plenty where younger animals help raise the older one's offspring, especially if they are helping to raise their siblings, but only one other group where multiple breeding pairs pool their resources and raise the offspring together. Those are the banded mongooses of the genus Mungos. Obviously, humans do this sometimes too, but as with biomes, humans seem to have explored every reproductive strategy out there. It seems like this strategy might have evolved on account of a high rate of nest predation. In one study of a population in Panama, researchers found that only 43% of groups successfully raised one chick to fledging. However, cooperative breeding among not necessarily related pairs also presents the opportunity to essentially cheat by evicting the eggs of other birds. This same study found that egg eviction increased with group size, with groups larger than 3 pairs rarely successful, and also found that the first few eggs laid were always ejected. This looks to me like an interesting example of the Machiavellian intelligence hypothesis in action. To successfully raise your young, you need to cooperate with a couple of like-minded couples, but this also increases the temptation to cheat. So to make the cooperation work, you need to make it such that the cost of cheating does not outweigh the benefits of cooperation in pursuit of a greater goal. Having to think about other minds in this fashion, I think, might explain the behavior of girafes I've observed in zoos. Girafes, which according to the San Francisco Zoo also exhibit cooperative nesting behavior, show a genuine interest in me in a way that is unusual for birds, but which I've noticed from both parrots and chickadees. Both parrots and chickadees live in flocks with hierarchical pecking orders, although chickadees only do so in winter, and keeping track of your status relative to others and everybody else's status is one of the classic examples of Machiavellian intelligence. Of course, parrots and chickadees are also known as adaptable problem solvers, and not every bird that lives in a complex, individualized society seems to show interest in humans in the way that parrots and chickadees tend to. But I will say, based on my own experience, that while not all birds that live in complex, individualized societies have shown interest in me, all the birds that have shown interest in me live in complex, individualized societies. I believe this is because social animals who have to keep track of specific other members of their group also often seem to be more aware of the behavior of members of other species, especially when they are frequently exposed to those species or grow up with them, which are not necessarily predators or prey. I think this also explains why so many of the most popular pets are naturally highly social animals. Even domestic cats, stereotypically solitary animals, are dramatically more social than their wild relatives. You'll notice that I come back to the tail multiple times as I try to figure out exactly how I want to represent the tail feathers in a somewhat abstracted form. This and the patterning of the neck feathers are the two things that I had not figured out from my previous attempts, but the rest I had down by this point. When I make animal figurines, I generally use this little ball tool to make holes for the eyes, and then roll little balls of clay that I stick in and flatten slightly. It's a little bit more annoying to do with air dry clay because it dries out so quickly, and if you dip it in water it's hard to work with at this size, but ultimately I manage. I'm trying to abstract the salient features of the groove-billed Ani, and so for the beak I made a bit of an indent indicating the edge of the beak. One line which could be a groove or the division between the upper and lower beak, and then 2 lines that are definitely grooves on either side. For the feathers, I am making an indent to indicate the line where the primaries start, and then 2 lines to suggest a row of primaries similar to those 2 lines on the beak to suggest a bill that is much groovier on the actual bird than in my figurine. Groove-billed anis also have blue edges to the contour feathers of their wings. In this sculpture, I'm going to suggest this with 6 semicircular indentations that I will paint blue on the edges. You will also see that I eventually decide to try to represent the sharply triangular feathers on the neck, with a series of similar indentations on the side and front. This is not something I did in previous attempts, because I forgot that I have a tool that seems perfect for the job. So anyways, let's talk about the feet of cuckoos, because cuckoos are one of several groups of birds which have zygodactyl feet, which is to say that both of the outside toes, which once faced forwards on their dinosaur ancestors, have bent backwards in this group. Zygodactyly has evolved several times, and is also found in parrots, owls, and the group of birds which includes both woodpeckers and toucans. It generally seems to be associated with a lifestyle that involves a lot of climbing around trees as opposed to flying, and it's a feature I've noticed that a lot of artists get wrong. Like this parrot, by Ghanaian sculptor Daniel Kwarku, is one of my all-time favorite pieces of folk art in my collection, because I love parrots and it is just so expressive. However, while he captured the body language of parrots beautifully, you will notice that he gave it the typical bird foot arrangement of 3 toes in front and 1 toe in back. I've also occasionally encountered the opposite, where a folk artist assumes that all birds have zygodactyl feet, as with this crested caracara, although this is considerably less common, and in this case might be done for stability. And while feet are generally not a part of birds that most people notice, it still bugs me when I see stuff like this. Part of this may be because I can be an insufferable pedant at times, but also as someone who has lived with Mother Nature's attempt at fashioning a monkey out of a flying velociraptor for most of my life, I find their little zygodactyl foot hands just impossibly adorable. I mean, look at them! So as much as I love folk art, it also bugs me a teeny bit when owls and cuckoos and toucans, and especially parrots, have the wrong toe arrangements in artistic depictions. But speaking of folk art, is there any sort of folk art or toys or such representing this small but extremely cool group of birds, the social nesting cuckoos? The next closest relatives of the social nesting cuckoos are a group of cuckoos that include the ground cuckoos and the roadrunners. And obviously roadrunners are iconic, even when you leave out the Warner Brothers cartoon character. I myself have a few roadrunner tchotchkes, most notably these two, an ironwood roadrunner from Mexico, and this ceramic roadrunner from Artesanía Rinconada in Uruguay. Someday I would actually love to make a whole video on the ceramic figurine studios of Uruguay, Brazil, and Peru, especially if I can find more information on some of those studios. But suffice it to say that I find the work of these studios really interesting, especially that of the original Rinconada and its copycats. Today there is a new Rinconada using the same brand name, which makes figurines more like your grandmother would collect. They are pretty, but I feel like they mostly don't have the same charm as the originals, while costing considerably more. Anyways, we know there's plenty of stuff depicting roadrunners, but what about the Crotaphagine social nesting cuckoos themselves? I will start with the gira. Is there anything interesting in terms of folk art? The only thing I found is this line-a-cut print on Etsy. I did not find anything for the greater ani. When it comes to the smooth-billed ani, there are an unusual number of stamps from tiny Caribbean islands, because there are a bunch of tiny Caribbean islands in its range. I don't normally plan on featuring stamps, because most interesting animals can be found on stamps, and the same goes for old scientific drawings. But the sheer number of stamps here I thought was worth a mention. I also found someone who drew a smooth-billed ani with one of those scratch boards, and she definitely did a whole lot better than I would be able to do in a medium where you can't erase anything. The groove-billed ani itself is interesting, because I actually filmed the original footage and wrote the first draft of this script in early 2023. At the time, I was only able to find one thing that was not a stamp or old scientific drawing depicting a groove-billed ani, a wood sculpture from a seller in China who seems to be offering every bird in North America, going for about $600. This time around, though, there are 2 sculptures from North American sellers, one on eBay, one on Etsy. But what's even more interesting is that there are a couple of people selling drawings of the groove-billed ani on Etsy, one of whom mentioned that she did it for a bird drawing challenge last year. So it looks like I might not be the only one trying to raise awareness of this cool South Texas native. And speaking of South Texas, there is a seller on eBay in McAllen, Texas, who does postcards that he has drawn of various South Texas birds, including the groove-billed ani. My plan is theoretically eventually to link stuff. And actually, my original plan for this channel was I was going to try to become an affiliate for Navica, an awesome folk art and crafts marketplace based in San Antonio that I have bought a bunch of stuff from. This includes this little roadrunner I got from Mauricio Morales in Mexico, who also does quite a lot of figurines of interesting birds. The caracara I showed earlier as an example of an artist who depicts non-zygodactyl birds with zygodactyl feet is also his work. However, right now anyways, Navica not only doesn't have anything featuring the social nesting cuckoos and roadrunners, including from Mauricio Morales, it has remarkably few things featuring cuckoos at all. There are a few cuckoo clocks, 2 paintings by a Mexican artist of what looks like the squirrel cuckoo, and then these little papier-mâché ornaments from an Indian artist that supposedly depict 3 different cuckoos. Based on the coloration, I immediately recognize the greenest one as the Asian emerald cuckoo, a true brood parasitic cuckoo, and the brown one with a black head as either the greater or lesser cuckool from a non-brood parasitic lineage. All of these are members of the cuckoo family native to India. However, the third bird I have not been able to identify. The color would be consistent with the malkohas, a brightly colored group of cuckoos from South and Southeast Asia, but there is no species of malkoha with this particular color pattern. I'm pretty sure it's not a cuckoo at all, but if anyone, maybe a viewer in India, knows what this third bird is, I would be very curious. Anyways, after the figurine has dried out enough, I will sand it down a little bit, and then paint it using acrylic paint. The groove-billed Ani is an all-black bird, and you can definitely make art that is quite striking in all black, which is a part of why I think crows and ravens are such a popular subject. But the groove-billed Ani also has a good deal of iridescence to it, especially with the contour feathers of the wings, which have bluish edges. So I'm going to do 1 coat of paint in blue, and then another bit of blue for the edges of the contour feathers, and a few blue dots around the neck to represent the same effect on the neck feathers. I will also attempt to use a very light dusting of purple paint to suggest iridescence. One advantage that air-dry clay and paint has over glaze is that you can paint the bottom. I still want to do some stuff with real clay and glaze, fired in a kiln eventually. There's just something about the contrast between the bisque and glaze of a finished ceramic piece. The final thing that I want to talk about with respect to the groove-billed Ani is the distribution of the social nesting cuckoos as a whole. And that gets us to the biogeographically unusual part of my channel name. The Gira and the greater Ani live in South America exclusively, which, given the Gira is the most divergent species, suggests that this is where the group likely evolved. However, the groove-billed Ani and the smooth-billed Ani both spread into the United States by different routes. The groove-billed Ani covers much of Central America, reaching up all the way into South Texas, while the smooth-billed Ani appears to have island-hopped all the way across the Caribbean to Florida. Alfred Russel Wallace, father of biogeography, divided the world into broad biogeographic kingdoms that are still commonly in use today, with North America from northern Mexico north falling into the Nearctic, and the rest of the Americas falling into the Neotropic. However, the real world is not nearly so neat, and Wallace himself identified the islands between New Guinea and the Philippines as a zone of transition between Australian and Asian animals. Recent authors have challenged Wallace's regionalization of the world in a number of ways, and as part of that, some of them have attempted to identify transition zones between all the major biogeographic kingdoms. So between the Neotropic and Nearctic, we have the Mexican transition zone, and yet all the definitions that I have seen of that zone usually do not include South Texas. And yet many animals found in the Neotropic traditionally extend into South Texas, including historically the jaguar, proof that Mother Nature is not nearly as neat as we humans might like, and my personal instinct might be to extend the scope of the transition zones further. Also, at the other side of its range, the groove-billed Ani spans into the transition zone with the Antarctic Kingdom, which Moroni has named the Andean Transition Zone. The groove-billed Ani occupies a large part of this zone, and yet not the South American portions of the Neotropic, except at the very far north. I would imagine that probably its range was more contiguous during the Ice Age, and it prefers cooler climates compared to the greater Ani. The Caribbean, which sometimes includes South Florida, is not traditionally considered a transition zone, because due to the prevailing winds, most of the animals and plants come from South America and not from North America. That said, I think you could potentially make a case for South Florida as a very small second transition zone, because unlike the Caribbean proper, it is directly connected to North America and is usually grouped with the Nearctic. So I find the range of these two species of Ani an opportunity to highlight the question of what qualifies as a transition zone between the greater biogeographic kingdoms. And there we have it, my groove-billed Ani, the first piece of art I am presenting on this channel. I also think I may be the first person ever to depict this particular bird in clay sculpture. The channel itself is also a new thing so far as I know. I am making this channel because I want to combine my love of animals and natural history with my interest in folk art and crafts. Obviously there are a number of, hey, look at this weird animal channels on YouTube, and a bunch of people making crafts of animals, but as far as I know, no one has yet thought to combine the two. Anyways, if you like this video, please like and subscribe, and I'll see y'all next time.